There are some construction projects so large, so transformative, that once they exist, people stop noticing them. They become part of the landscape, part of the map, part of the background of history. And yet, if they had never been built, entire industries might have grown more slowly, cities might have risen in different places, and the economic map of a continent might look nothing like it does today. The Soo Locks are one of those projects. Today, they sit at Sault Ste. Marie, between Lake Superior and Lake Huron, quietly lifting and lowering ships as if they had always been there. Freighters move through them carrying iron ore, grain, coal, and stone. Tourists stand at railings and watch steel giants rise and fall with the water. It feels orderly, mechanical, routine. But the existence of the Soo Locks was never routine. Because in the early 1850s, before those locks existed, the rapids of the St. Mary's River formed a brutal barrier between Lake Superior and the lower Great Lakes. It was only about 3/4 of a mile of white water and rock, but that short distance blocked access to one of the richest mineral regions in North America. And the man who stepped forward to solve that problem was not a celebrated engineer, not a famous military builder, not a seasoned canal master. He was a 2-3-year-old named Charles T. Harvey. He had never led a project on this scale. He had no formal engineering education. He had no vast reserve of heavy machinery waiting in a depot somewhere. He arrived in this northern outpost after recovering from illness, looked at a wall of river rock and rapids, and became convinced that he could cut a canal through it. That conviction helped change the history of the Great Lakes. This is the story of how men carved the Soo Locks out of stone, how they opened Lake Superior to world trade, and how a project in what was then frontier wilderness became one of the hidden foundations of industrial America. To understand why the Soo Locks mattered so much, you first have to understand what stood behind them. Lake Superior is not just another lake, it is enormous, vast enough to feel like an inland sea, cold, deep, and powerful. It stretches across an immense region, and in the 19th century it guarded extraordinary mineral wealth. In Michigan's Upper Peninsula, especially in the Keweenaw region, copper deposits were drawing attention from investors and speculators. This was not a small local curiosity. This was one of the most important copper districts in the United States. At the same time, explorers and surveyors were identifying major iron ore deposits around what would later become the Marquette Range and beyond. These were resources with the power to feed a rising industrial economy. America, in the mid-19th century, was hungry for raw materials. It needed copper for wiring, tools, machinery, and infrastructure. It needed iron for rails, engines, construction, and, eventually, the steel industry that would help define the modern age. The country was growing, building, connecting, and mechanizing. And the Upper Great Lakes had exactly the materials that growth required. But there was a problem. To get from Lake Superior down toward the lower lakes, every vessel had to confront the St. Mary's Rapids at Sault Ste. Marie. The river dropped about 21 feet across a short, violent stretch. Canoes and small craft could be managed around it with effort. But for loaded commercial vessels, especially the larger steam-powered ships beginning to reshape Great Lakes transport, those rapids were effectively a dead end. So cargo had to be transferred manually. Imagine the inefficiency of it. Ore, metal, and supplies would be loaded onto a vessel on one side, brought as far as possible, unloaded by hand, moved overland around the rapids by tramway, wagon, or horsepower, and then loaded again onto another vessel below the falls. Every step cost time, every step costs money, every step limited how much the region could produce and export. The Upper Lakes were rich, but they were bottlenecked, and bottlenecks shape history. No matter how abundant the copper veins were, no matter how thick the ore beds proved to be, the wealth of the region could never move at full force as long as a narrow strip of rapids stood in the way. A natural obstacle, a fraction of a mile long, was slowing the economic development of an entire interior empire. People understood this. The idea of bypassing the rapids was not new. There had even been an earlier, much smaller lock on the Canadian side decades before, built for a completely different age of transport. But what the 1850s demanded was something far larger, something capable of handling modern commercial traffic, something strong enough to survive the climate, the water pressure, the ice, and the constant use that would follow. The federal government was not eager to take this on. At one stage, the project was dismissed at the national level as too remote, too impractical, too far out on the frontier to justify the investment. That hesitation is one of the most striking parts of the story, because with hindsight, it seems obvious that opening the route between Lake Superior and the rest of the Great Lakes was hugely important. But hindsight is easy. At the time, Sault Ste. Marie was not from Chicago. It was not Pittsburgh. It was not New York. It was a distant northern settlement on the edge of what much of the country still regarded as wilderness. Building a major canal there sounded to many officials like a gamble in a place too far away to matter. Michigan disagreed. The state understood what lay beyond the rapids. If this channel could be opened, the mineral wealth of the Upper Peninsula would pour south in volumes that could transform the economy of the Great Lakes. So when Washington hesitated, Michigan pushed ahead using a federal land grant. The state received 750,000 acres of public land, which could be sold to finance the canal. That mechanism matters because it shows the kind of America this was, a country funding infrastructure not only with cash in hand, but with land, speculation, ambition, and risk. And into that mix stepped Charles T. Harvey. Harvey was young, almost shockingly young for a project of this magnitude. He had not spent decades climbing through elite engineering institutions. He did not arrive wrapped in prestige. What he did have was determination, organizational ability, and an unusual belief that this impossible-looking task could actually be done. That confidence may sound romantic in hindsight, but confidence alone does not cut stone. Harvey still had to solve the reality of the place. And the reality was harsh. Sault Ste. Marie in 1853 was remote. There were few local resources, no convenient industrial supply network, no nearby railroad capable of feeding the site with tools, timber, iron, blasting powder, food, and labor on demand. Almost everything needed for the project had to be transported in from far away, largely by water, and only during the navigation season when the lakes were open. That meant Harvey was not just building a canal, he was building the conditions under which a canal could be built. He needed housing for workers, he needed food distribution, he needed timber processing, he needed storage, he needed tools. He needed some way to maintain discipline, momentum, and morale at a site where nature, distance, and logistics were constantly fighting back. And most of all, he needed labor. At the height of construction, the workforce numbered roughly between 1,600 and 2,000 men. They were not one uniform group. Many were Irish immigrants, toughened by hard migration and harder labor. Others included French Canadians familiar with northern conditions, plus miners and skilled workmen from backgrounds where drilling, blasting, and stonework were already part of life. These were men who knew what brutal physical work felt like, and even for them, this job was extraordinary. Because the canal route was not waiting in soft soil, it had to be cut through bedrock. The proposed canal stretched roughly 5,500 feet beside the rapids. The excavation had to create a navigable path, and at the lower end, it would include 2 large lock chambers. The scale for the era was formidable. These were not decorative structures or modest water gates. These were major works intended to handle real commercial vessels and absorb the force of a substantial change in water level. Before steam shovels, before diesel excavators, before hydraulic breakers, men attacked the rock by hand. This is the part of the story people tend to underestimate, because modern minds are trained by modern machinery. When we hear that a canal was cut through stone, many of us instinctively imagine the stone being conquered by machines. But in the early 1850s, the rhythm of the work came from bodies. Men drilled holes manually into the rock face. One worker held and turned the drill steel, another struck it again and again with a heavy hammer, blow after blow, rotation after rotation. A deepening hole formed slowly in the stone, then more holes, then more. Once enough had been drilled, they were packed with black powder. And then came the blast. The explosion shattered sections of rock into fragments that could finally be removed, but blasting in the 1850s was dangerous and unforgiving. Charges had to be set correctly. Misfires could maim or kill. There was no modern industrial safety system standing guard over every step. Survival depended on experience, caution, and the habits of men who knew how quickly rockwork could become deadly. After each blast, the site still had to be cleared. Broken stone was loaded into wheelbarrows, carts, and haul systems. Horses were brought into parts of the excavation. Ramps had to be built and rebuilt as the shape of the cut changed. Rubble had to be taken out, dumped, and managed so the work could continue. Every foot of progress required drilling, blasting, lifting, hauling, organizing, and repeating the whole cycle. It was exhausting work in good weather. And northern Michigan does not promise good weather for long. Winter made the project even more difficult. Snow and ice collected in the excavation, equipment stiffened in the cold. The men had to work in freezing conditions, often before dawn, in a place where the wind coming off the water could feel merciless. Powder had to be protected. Timber structures had to be watched. Horses needed care. The entire site required constant management just to remain functional. This is one of the reasons Harvey's role matters. You can debate how much credit any single person deserves on a major project. No canal is carved by one visionary alone. It is carved by hundreds or thousands of workers whose names often vanish from the story. That is true here too. The laborers, stonemasons, carpenters, shipwrights, haulers, drillers, and crews on the ground were indispensable. Without them, Harvey's ambition would have remained talk. But leadership still matters when conditions are this unstable. Somebody had to keep the operation moving. Somebody had to coordinate supplies in a place far from major infrastructure. Somebody had to make decisions quickly when weather, stone, manpower, and timing collided. Somebody had to keep enough trust within the workforce that the job did not collapse under its own hardship. By all accounts, Harvey did that. He may not have fit the polished image of a formal engineer, but he proved capable of running a colossal undertaking in one of the most difficult environments imaginable for a project of that era. As the excavation advanced, the locks themselves began to take shape. This introduced another level of skill. Digging a canal is one challenge. Building lock chambers that can endure repeated use, hold back water, resist leakage, and survive seasonal stress is another. The walls had to be laid in cut limestone, carefully fitted course by course. Stone had to be quarried, dressed, positioned, and aligned with precision. A lock chamber is not just a hole with water in it, it is a pressure structure. If the masonry is poor, if the joints fail, if the geometry is off, the whole system becomes unreliable or dangerous. Then there were the gates. These massive wooden gates, built from durable timber such as white oak, had to fit correctly and close securely under water pressure. Their design was not ornamental. It relied on the force of water itself to help seal the structure when closed. That meant the craftsmanship had to be exact. Shipwright-level skill was needed to make these gates function reliably in one of the harshest freshwater climates on the continent. Think about what that means. On a remote frontier site, after blasting through rock, after recruiting and feeding a huge labor force, after surviving the winter, the builders still had to finish a set of large, precisely functioning hydraulic structures that would work from the moment water met wood and stone. And somehow, they did it. The speed of the accomplishment remains astonishing. Construction began in April 1853. The first vessel passed through in June 1855. 22 months. That is the number that makes the whole story feel almost unreal. In less than 2 years, the crews excavated roughly 300,000 cubic yards of rock and earth, built 2 large lock chambers, and created a canal capable of bypassing the rapids and linking Lake Superior to the lower Great Lakes in a way never before possible for modern shipping. The total cost came in at just under $1 million, financed through Michigan's land grant arrangement rather than direct federal appropriation. Even that fact tells you something about the era. This was a project built with frontier urgency, public-private improvisation, and relentless physical labor. Then came the test that mattered most. On the 18th of June, 1855, the steamer Illinois became the first vessel to pass through the completed locks. For the people watching, this must have felt like watching a geographical fact get rewritten in real time. A ship entered the lock from the upper level, the chamber did its work, water levels changed, gates opened, and a vessel that previously would have had to unload its cargo and endure an awkward, expensive overland transfer simply moved through the obstacle. A barrier that had blocked efficient trade was no longer a barrier. That moment was more than ceremonial. It changed the economics of the entire region. Once the route opened, ore from Lake Superior country could move south more efficiently and in far greater volume. Copper shipments became easier. Iron ore traffic surged. The upper Great Lakes were no longer semi-isolated by the rapids. They were integrated into a broader transportation system that connected mines, furnaces, factories, ports, and markets. And when you follow that chain forward, you begin to see the real scale of the Soo Locks' importance. The iron deposits around Lake Superior would become critical to American industrial growth. The steel industry that expanded in places like Cleveland and Pittsburgh depended on access to raw materials on a massive scale. Railroads, bridges, machines, shipbuilding, and urban expansion all required iron and steel. The Great Lakes became an industrial artery, and the locks at Sault Ste. Marie became one of its essential valves. Without a workable passage at the Soo, the whole flow of material would have remained slower, costlier, and more limited. Now, to be clear, no single lock project created industrial America by itself. History is never that simple. Railroads mattered, coal mattered, capital mattered, immigration mattered, invention mattered, markets mattered. But the Soo Locks were one of those hidden enabling systems without which the larger machine could not run as effectively. They were infrastructure in the deepest sense of the word, not glamorous, not always celebrated, but fundamental. And like much infrastructure, they obscured the human cost once they were complete. That is another part of the story worth holding on to. When we talk about canals, locks, bridges, and ports, we often talk in outputs, tonnage, dimensions, dates, budgets, shipping capacity. We talk about the structures as triumphs of progress. And yes, they are. But they are also accumulations of labor. They are made from men's backs, hands, lungs, and nerves, from repetitive hammer strikes, from winter exposure, from risk accepted because work was needed and wages mattered. The surviving records tend to preserve totals better than personal histories. We know the measurements, we know the schedule, we know the approximate workforce, we know the canal was finished with extraordinary speed. What we often do not know in equal detail are the names of the men who stood over the drills, who tamped the powder, who rolled the rubble out, who laid the stone, who hung the gates, or who carried the exhaustion home to their bunks at night. Their work is still there though. Every ship that rises and falls at the Soo is moving through a space first carved open by men who had almost no technological cushion between their bodies and the rock. And then there is Harvey himself, whose story does not resolve into a neat national legend. This is important because history often flattens people into symbols. The young builder either becomes a celebrated genius or a forgotten failure. Real life is messier. Harvey achieved something extraordinary at the Soo, yet his later career did not unfold as a simple climb from triumph to glory. He became involved in other ventures, including an attempt to promote new transportation ideas, and not all of them succeeded. At one point, a public failure damaged his finances and reputation. So the man who helped deliver one of the most consequential infrastructure projects in Great Lakes history did not ride that achievement into untouchable prosperity. There is something almost fitting about that. The lock itself endured more visibly than the reputation of the man who oversaw its creation. That, too, is common in infrastructure history. The work remains, the names fade, the system becomes ordinary, and later, generations inherit the benefits without feeling the original uncertainty. But if you return to the spring of 1853, the uncertainty was everywhere. A young man with limited formal credentials is standing in a remote settlement. The government at the national level is unconvinced. The landscape is hostile. The route runs through solid rock. The weather will turn vicious. Thousands of laborers must be recruited, transported, housed, and fed. Stone must be cut, gates must be fitted, water pressure must be mastered, and the entire scheme has to be finished quickly enough to justify the money and belief invested in it. That is not a guaranteed success story. That is a gamble, and yet the gamble paid off. When people talk about opening the American interior, they often focus on famous railroads heading west, on canals like Erie, on Mississippi traffic, on eastern factories, on gold rushes, on transcontinental visions. All of those belong in the story, but the Soo deserves a place there too. Because opening Lake Superior to heavy commercial navigation did not just improve one local route, it unlocked a resource basin of enormous strategic value. It linked extraction zones to manufacturing zones. It reduced friction inside a continental transportation network. And in doing so, it helped shift the Great Lakes from a set of regional waterways into a major industrial corridor. That is why this story matters. It is not just a story about digging, it is a story about leverage. A short stretch of rapids had the power to choke a huge economic system, remove that obstacle, and the effects multiplied outward for decades. Mines became more valuable, shipping routes became more efficient, ports grew, factories received more raw material. The industrial map of the United States grew denser and more powerful. And all of it depended, in part, on a decision to carve a passage through stone at exactly the right moment. The Soo Locks also remind us that transformative infrastructure often begins in places elites underestimate. The site seemed too remote to some decision-makers, too marginal, too far from the centers that felt important. But distance can hide significance. Frontiers are often where resources, routes, and strategic bottlenecks wait for someone determined enough to recognize them. Harvey recognized one. So did the laborers who signed on, whether out of desperation, skill, opportunity, or all three. So did the state of Michigan, which understood that geography could be edited if there was enough political will and enough labor to force the issue. And that may be the most striking lesson of the whole story. The rapids were natural, the lock was artificial, nature set the terms, but human beings revised them. Not cheaply, not safely, not elegantly, but effectively. That is what engineering often is at its core, the refusal to accept that the landscape has the final word. At Soo Suite, Marie, that refusal took the shape of hammer drills, black powder, limestone walls, white oak gates, frozen mornings, crowded barracks, horse-drawn hauling, and relentless repetition. Day after day, month after month, until a vessel could pass where no vessel of that kind had passed before. And once it happened, the impossible became normal. That is the final magic trick of infrastructure. First, it is unthinkable. Then it is controversial. Then it is difficult. Then it is expensive. Then it is achieved. And after enough time passes, people wonder how the world ever functioned without it. That is the Soo Locks, a structure born from frontier ambition, built by immigrant labor and hard stone work, dismissed by some as too remote to matter, and ultimately so successful that it became inseparable from the rise of Great Lakes commerce itself. So the next time you see a freighter move through Soo Suite Marie, remember what lies beneath the routine. Remember the rapids that once stopped everything. Remember the copper and iron waiting behind them. Remember the 2-3-year-old who believed the barrier could be cut aside. Remember the thousands of workers who made that belief physical. And remember that sometimes the world changes not when an empire conquers a new land or a politician gives a famous speech, but when a group of determined men in a cold, distant place carve a new path through rock and let commerce flow. Because once the Soo was opened, Lake Superior was no longer a locked chamber of the wilderness. It became part of the industrial bloodstream of a continent, and the world that followed was built, in no small measure, on that passage.